as you join. So hi, everybody. My name is Glenis Pagan. I'm the Executive Director of Philanthropy Puerto Rico, and we are a philanthropy serving organization that connects grant-making entities and major donors to amplify their voice and amplify their impact in areas of equity, social justice, participation, transparency. And we have a great conversation prepared for you today. We'll be speaking to several people. We'll be speaking to community and nonprofit partners to understand the state of Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico's recovery after Hurricanes Irma and Maria 3 years ago, and really verify the actions needed to be taken to see how we can develop this process of guaranteeing an equitable recovery for everybody. We have a report that we'll be sharing with you. It's called Recovery After Maria, for when and for whom. And that's kind of what we'll be describing a lot today. But if you want more details, go ahead and check that report out. At the end of this conversation, we'll go ahead and have a dialogue, more a reflective dialogue with funders who have supported recovery efforts and their thoughts on how their philanthropic investments have impacted Puerto Rico and what is needed to move forward. Before we start, I want to thank the co-sponsors to this webinar, which is Environmental Grantmakers Association. Thank you so much. Hispanics in Philanthropy and Neighborhood Funders Group with the Amplify Fund. They helped us in sharing this invitation, and they are sister organizations to us. So to get us started, I want to go ahead and introduce two people to give us a little introduction and framing to today's conversation, really to talk a little bit about the deep social inequity that we have in Puerto Rico and how we have learned amongst different experiences being local and in the main island, and how this has shaped how civil society has responded as well. So I want to go ahead and introduce two of our initial speakers today. Merian Gavino, Senior Vice President of Fundación Comunitaria de Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico Community Foundation, and Karina Claudio Betancourt, who's the Director of Open Society Foundation in Puerto Rico. So ladies, if you want to jump in. Hi, welcome. So happy to see you.
Hola.
Marian, go ahead, get us started.
Sí. Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes. Es un privilegio para mí y para la Fundación Comunitaria de Puerto Rico ser parte de esta conversación. Hoy presentaré un brevísimo contexto sobre la isla con muchísimo respeto a quienes dominan totalmente esta información, a quienes trabajan y viven estas realidades en nuestras comunidades diariamente. Según se ha solicitado, continuaré en inglés para poder presentarlo. Puerto Rico has been living under great inequalities for centuries as a reflection of the imperative colonial status we've been subjected to, because the very concept of colonialism puts subjugation of dominant power over others being the most vulnerable of our society. Even after 500 years, we still live in a state of inequalities. Just to illustrate, 10 years before Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was submerged in a financial depression that became the basis of a very public financial crisis of a $72 billion debt and the imposition of a fiscal oversight management board. Our poverty level then was hitting 43.5%, meaning that more than 1.5 million Puerto Ricans were living under poverty level. At that time, 38.1% of Puerto Rico's families were in the nutritional assistance program, and there were approximately 3,500 homeless. Right after Hurricane Maria, the curtain was removed, and we realized how Puerto Rico was submerged in poverty with few pockets of wealth instead of few pockets of poverty, as we used to refer before. At that time, 3 years ago, an estimated poverty level of 52.3 was prevalent, meaning that 1.8 million were living under poverty level. According to the Youth Development Institute, 56.8% of children currently lives under poverty level. And as recent as Monday, a news article revealed that 68%, listen, 68% of women with children live under poverty level. This translates to limited access to quality education. Our kids have lost more than a year of school because of the hurricane and the earthquakes. And now with at home education, many don't have access to computers, internet, even their parents can't help them because of the lack of knowledge or even time. And then again, these are the most vulnerable of our society. Access to quality health services is also limited. And now with the pandemic, there has been a great effort from community-based organizations to undertake the education, prevention, and containment of the pandemic. Many are not receiving reliable energy and water resources. Only those that can pay for alternate sources have it uninterrupted, evidencing the huge equity gap existing on the island. And not to mention the many that lost their homes after the earthquakes or live in fear for not having a secure home after Maria and the earthquakes. These inequalities are going to continue as we see many losing their jobs to the pandemic, contributing to a stagnant economy. While this is going on, our emotional situation continues to break elderly, women, men, and children. After 2017, the world found out about Puerto Rico, its location in the Caribbean surrounded by a huge amount of water, and its inequality context within the island and within the subjugation relationship with power. However, the unprecedented bridge between the philanthropic community on the island and in the United States have made it possible for many communities to renew themselves, like Toro Negro in Ciales, the first solar community on the island, the soon-to-be solarized Culebra, and the planning and partnership undergoing to establish a green energy corridor. There are many challenges that still lie ahead because there is still so much to do. I encourage you to stay with us this afternoon and witness what's being done with the support of many of you that are here today, community-based organizations, funders, collaborators, foundations, and what still needs to be accomplished. We need your continued support in maintaining Puerto Rico a top priority. Thank you.
Gracias, Marianne. So my name is Karina Claudia Betancourt, and I'm the director of the Puerto Rico project for the Open Society Foundations. Open Society Foundations was already in Puerto Rico investing in projects around government transparency and accountability before Hurricane Maria, but after Hurricane Maria, we saw the urgency, right, to expand our investments and to really look at strengthening the social justice movements, organizations, and the individuals that were holding down these social justice movements. So our investment here, our initial commitment is for 5 years, $20 million, and we made an intentional commitment that was for 5 years because we knew that the horizon for recovery takes time. We've seen it in New Orleans and from New York, and we still see at this day that federal money is going towards Sandy and Katrina recovery. So why would it be different in Puerto Rico, and why would it be different for philanthropy, right? Philanthropy before Hurricane Maria, US-based philanthropy invested about $3 million on programs on the island. $3 million. That is not even, that's just not enough, right? For all of the inequities that Marianne was talking about. So that number was tripled after Hurricane Maria, but now how do we sustain it? This is what we are doing today, right? We're calling on philanthropy to really commit to the island long term. We know that recovery takes a long time and that philanthropy needs to be here and needs to be committed to those that are most impacted and those who are most vulnerable. And so the report that we are publishing today around just recovery really centers the conversation around how do we get this philanthropic dollars to the most vulnerable communities, but also the communities that were most creative after Hurricane Maria. we saw after Hurricane Maria a series of mutual aid centers that popped up across all of the island. I remember coming here the Monday after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and seeing how community-based organizations like Taller Salud were already planning to go to go and disperse aid that was coming from the diaspora to their communities. And we saw different mutual aid centers come about in different parts of the island. And this mutual aid model is now really resonating with movements in the US. But here in Puerto Rico, this is how many communities survived Hurricane Maria. The government, the federal government and the local government completely abandoned our communities. And the mutual aid centers fed people, organized brigades to save farms, to save schools, to take over spaces that had been abandoned after Maria, and still to this day are in those communities, transforming the civic engagement and the fabric of those communities. So it's really important that our philanthropic dollars go directly to the communities that are most impacted, but also to these organizations, NGOs, movement leaders that are looking for creative ways to engage their communities in the recovery that they want to see, in a recovery that's led by Puerto Ricans for Puerto Ricans. And that, I think, is a centerpiece of this report that we will be highlighting today. The Center for a New Economy, which we'll be speaking later today, published a report that says that as of September 2019, $4.8 billion have gone to outside firms for recovery work, and $0.66 billion to local Puerto Rican firms. So this means that most of the money, which has not been a lot, the money right now that the federal government appropriated was around $40 billion. Only 16% of that has been dispersed around, and close to that has been, close to 6% has been spent by the Puerto Rican government. But most of it has gone to outside firms. So another big part of this report that we're publishing today is really looking to highlight how we need to build local capacity. We need to build local power in communities, and we need to build local capacity of Puerto Rican firms and Puerto Rican groups, because otherwise another disaster like Hurricane Maria, which will inevitably happen again, will catch us off guard and unprepared for the challenges of climate change that lie ahead. So I will leave you with that reflection. I thank you, Glenice and Philanthropia Puerto Rico, for bringing us together today. And I hope that we all have a rich conversation and that we end up with firm commitments to continue to invest on the island and on the just recovery of the island. Gracias.
Gracias a ti, Karina, Marianne. Thank you for beginning and giving us a broader view of what we're going to be talking about today, and really the call to action that at the end of the call we'll talk more about. But let's go ahead and really give an opportunity for all these organizations that have been doing the work consistently, diligently, and with a lot of effort. So let's start this conversation of where are we in the recovery process. I want to go ahead and bring 3 organizations that bring very different perspective. Starting with a community perspective, I invite Maria Olga Julia Pacheco, who's the Social Participation and Development Director of Fideicomiso de la Tierra del Caño Martín Peña, with a policy of Puerto Rico and DC policy view and advocacy perspective. We have Deepak Lamba Nieves, Research Director of Center for a New Economy, and with the local government perspective, y municipalista, which I love from Cristina, we have Cristina Miranda Palacios, Founding Executive Director de la Liga de Ciudades. And to moderate this conversation, we have a member of Philanthropia Puerto Rico, Charlotte Goset Navarro, Chief Director for Hispanic Federation in Puerto Rico. So take it away. Thank you.
Gracias, Glenis. Thank you.
Happy.
So we'll jump right into it. We have the opportunity here to hear from a few of the folks who helped develop this report, right? It was based on feedback from nonprofit organizations who are working and community-based organizations who are working here in Puerto Rico. And so in addition to you being able to read it there, we want you to have the opportunity to hear directly from them and to talk about some of those recommendations that are made in that report. Starting with a question really about funding. There's been a lot of misinformation out there about funding and how much money has come to Puerto Rico, a lot of confusion about it, what's been allocated, what's actually arrived. We know there are billions of dollars. We know there have been lots of barriers, lots of delays to that funding getting here to Puerto Rico. And then once it's here, we know that it's been slow to spend. So to help give us some context and help clarify for us how much funding and what is actually going on with the funding that's been allocated for Puerto Rico, I'm going to ask Deepak to dig in on that a little bit, and as well as to further expand by sharing a little bit about how can we be more strategic and transparent in the way that those funds are used.
Well, thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you to the organizers of this great convening. I'll be covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time, and Marianne touched upon some of the issues I'll be raising, but they're worth repeating. So please bear with me and feel free to ask questions later on. To give you a bit of background on the economic front, since 2006, the island has been suffering a prolonged economic depression. Before the hurricanes, the earthquakes, and COVID, we were evidencing major declines in economic growth, in employment, gross domestic fixed investment, and population figures. And moreover, we have seen rising levels of inequality. Poverty stands at 43%, much, much higher than the 13% evidence in the US. And median income in Puerto Rico is around $20,000, less than a third of that of the US. Now, this secular decline is due to a number of factors, including a nefarious colonial legacy, an outdated economic development model, and clear governance deficiencies that have led to, amongst other calamities, unsustainable debt levels and the eventual congressional takeover of our fiscal apparatus through the control board, the federal control board, through PROMESA. The cascade of catastrophic events that has actually engulfed us since 2017 has made matters worse, especially for the most vulnerable. But there's a generalized expectation that billions in federal reconstruction funds will allow us to, quote, build back better and bounce back, end quote. At present, $45 billion have been allocated by Congress. 38 billion have been obligated, and only 16 billion have been actually outlaid to Puerto Rico. Keep in mind that that 45 billion is about half of the 90 billions that Trump has repeatedly stated that he has provided to the island. Now, to anyone that has been to the island recently, it is clear that the recovery has yet to take off, if you will, or actually produce any demonstrable progress. This is due to a number of factors, and I'll only name a few. First, because post-disaster reconstruction is usually a long, costly, and contentious process. Second, because Congress has placed unique restrictions and conditions on the use of reconstruction dollars. And third, because years of austerity policies have eroded administrative capacity in our public service infrastructure. Before the storms hit, key agencies like the local Department of Housing were understaffed and underprepared for the gargantuan task that now lies before them. This has led to a mad rush to actually build necessary administrative systems, which unfortunately have been outsourced to major consulting firms from the US. This last point brings me to the original question, because instead of strategically leveraging the recovery to build much needed internal capacity in our public agencies, we're actually privatizing our administrative capacity. Once the money runs out, so will the top dollar firms, leaving us in yet another capacity vacuum. Interestingly, some local capacity is being built in the NGO space. At the Center for the New Economy, for example, where I work, we have been using numerous data sources to produce academic level research and analysis that helps us identify damages, needs, and opportunities, and ultimately advocate for much needed policy and program changes. But beyond unfettered access to reconstruction data and good research, we also need better and more responsive planning systems. As the post-disaster literature suggests, we need to take this opportunity to upgrade our planning infrastructure and build collaborative ties between federal, state, and local community institutions. The current reconstruction plans include a hodgepodge of programs that will not add up to a just recovery that serves those who most need it. Programs and plans should be redesigned from the bottom up and in a coordinated manner that allows for effective and constant participation from residents who will actually bear the brunt of the decisions made. Lastly, to improve transparency, we should not be limited to access to, which it's a definition that should not be only circumscribed to access to data. We need to devise more open and representative decision-making structures that can facilitate what we at the CNE call oversight that works. Taking advantage of the wave of civic engagement that has blossomed in years past, and Karina mentioned a lot of great groups, we proposed in August of 2019 the creation of a civic committee for transparency and reconstruction. This committee should be empowered to monitor and evaluate the work of the Core 3, which is the Central Office for Recovery, Reconstruction, or Relocation. And it should be empowered to provide reports on the progress of the reconstruction to the Governor of Puerto Rico, to Congress, and relevant federal agencies. The committee, we think, should also independently audit any efforts on the reconstruction, especially those done under the Core 3. Now, there's still a lot of road ahead, but there's certainly much to do if we're going to turn this reconstruction into a process that leads to a just and equitable outcome for our residents, and is also, as Karina mentioned, led by the residents of our island. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak, and that was a great ending because it leads us right into our next question. You brought up some issues, and the report does as well, about the problems created when everything is centralized, when there's a lack of public participation, and ensuring that the voices of people who have been most impacted and are still most vulnerable are not able to truly participate in that strategy and in that process. And so, Maria Olga, I'd like to move to you for a moment and ask if you can share a little bit about how we can make sure those diverse voices and the voices of communities really are included in the recovery process, particularly when we know that the current process does not facilitate that.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the ending of Deepak. As you said, it was the transition for my part. I think that one of the first things that we need to do to start hearing other voices is to take out the process of San Juan and metropolitan area, because everything is happening in San Juan, and not all communities and not all grassroots projects are in San Juan. And we have many important initiatives along the island that need to be heard and need to be part of the process. And it's really important for the organizations that are in San Juan, as the one that I work with, do not take the voices of those other communities in other parts of the island. So I think the first challenge is the mistrust that all of us have in the government, in the structures, and especially in the ability to implement the projects, because we are 3 years from the hurricane and we haven't reconstructed even one house at this point. So it's really important to start building up that trust process with the housing department, with the new administration, along our organizations, in order to be a more powerful voice in this process. The other thing that I would like to add is that there's a lack of recognition of different participation processes that have had take place in our country. I could take, for example, the different planning process that went on with the Ley of Comunidades Especiales, Law number 1 from 2000, if anyone wants to look it up, or Law 489 of 2004, which has the comprehensive development plan for the Caño communities. And they have been ignoring the different processes that have already taken place, and we could be gaining time in this recuperation process to make justice to the people that had been suffering, not only the Maria effects, but also the tremor season that we just had, the pandemic season that we're living, etc. Also, I think that an important thing to analyze is that the different victories that we have had in these recuperation processes from the different organizations, they have become from working in the sideline. So adding to the mistrust from the people, you have that the small victories that we have had, for an example, the titling with evidence with FEMA that Ayuda Legal did, that was an outside victory. You know, they had to go directly to HUD, they had to move around the housing, Department of Housing, so that doesn't move people to participate and to engage in processes which they don't believe they are working. And you can see that in the process of the CDBG-DR action plan, you don't see reflected the comments from the communities or the comments from the organizations. We're in the comments process right now of the CDBG meet, and let's see how does it takes. So I think making advocacy inside your organizations and outside your organizations at different levels is really important in this moment to be a key a stakeholder and a key moment to change the game.
Gracias, Maria Olga. Cristina, I want to bring the same question to you with a little bit of a different perspective, right? Because your organization is nonpartisan and works with the municipalities here in Puerto Rico. So thinking again about the issue of centralization of a lot of this decision-making, Maria Olga mentioned San Juan specifically, right? And about ensuring diverse voices are included in this process. Can you talk a little bit about what you think needs to happen to ensure that process is shifted and that those diverse voices are included?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the invite to be here. I think that we have to remember that for something to really work, the foundation has to be well designed. And I think that the basis in Puerto Rico of the issue is the way that the recovery process, in terms of accessing the funding, the design is really faulty. So in La Liga, what we're asking is for four main things. First of all, decentralization of all recovery funds, because what good is having funding if it cannot be accessed, right? So we can have all the voices, but if the funding can't be accessed, then there's no use in having the money. The other thing that we're asking for is the elimination of the reimbursement requirement. I mean, if municipalities don't have the funding to spend the money in the recovery, I can't imagine the organizations, the local nonprofit organizations, have even less access to funding. So we have municipalities that have a lot of projects that have been approved, the plans have been designed, but they can't complete the process because they don't have the funding to spend it and then to get it reimbursed. And you have to also remember that there's the intersectionality of all the crises that are happening in Puerto Rico. So in the terms of the local governments, municipalities are not only answering or working with what's related to the recovery process, but now they have the impact of the earthquakes, the impact of COVID, and all the economic impact that's happening. In La Liga, what we're asking for is a derogation of the PROMESA or the Fiscal Control Board. We know that that is not something that we think it's going to happen. So what we're asking Congress is for the elimination of the reach of PROMESA when it comes to municipalities. And now the other thing that we're asking is with the vacant slots that we have in the board, that those spaces are filled with people that have a real commitment to Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of voices out there, but the voices they can't speak, but they can't access the funding because the foundation was badly designed.
Well, Christine, if we can dig a little deeper on that. In the report, it does talk about the importance, and actually, Deepak, you mentioned this specifically, the importance of making sure that those funds stay local and making sure that they're invested into communities and nonprofits and local businesses. And given all of the barriers that you just described, Cristina, from the reimbursements, the decision-making process, PROMESA, right? How reasonable is it for the municipalities in this case, right, to actually access those funds, to participate in those processes in order to really ensure that those funds get into the communities and are used where they're most needed?
Well, it's like a huge gridlock. I mean, it's super hard to actually access the funding just because of the way it was designed. I mean, and now the new narrative in Puerto Rico is that municipalities are the ones at fault for not accessing the funding. But if the guidelines are not well designed, if they're not well communicated, how do you want me to compete for funding if I don't know the rules of the game? And of course, this isn't a game, right? It's not a game. But the rules have not been clearly defined, and the rules keep constantly changing. It happens with TDD-GDR, it happens with FEMA. So when a municipality is ready to complete a process, then what do they get in return? Oh, we changed the process. So it's really, really hard. Adding to that, to what Deepak said about the outsourcing of the process, there's a lack of cultural competence when it comes to a lot of the resources that have been brought to Puerto Rico to how to manage the funding. So it's a recipe for disaster. I mean, I think that we're looking at it's actually the perfect storm, because we have all of the intersectionality of the crisis, not only the hurricanes, the summer of 2019, the fiscal crisis that we've been managing or surviving for a long time. And now you add this, you are making it really hard, not you, Charlotte, but the government is making it really hard for municipalities, for nonprofit organizations to actually access the money. The amount of time that municipalities have to invest in talking about how to access the money, how to access the funds, it's just, it's impossible. And people are exhausted because it's just so hard to do. And the narrative in Puerto Rico doesn't really add to that. There has to be a deeper conversation. What you're doing with the report, I think it's going to be a huge, it's something really good for Puerto Rico, so that we can have a conversation about how to really work with the funding so that the money goes where they're needed, to the communities. At the end of the day, municipalities are a conduit for transformation. So it's not for funding for the mayors, it's funding for the communities, and it has to be easier to access the money.
Thank you. Maria Olga, I'd like to give you an opportunity also to answer that, because I know there are some unique challenges that nonprofits in particular and community-based organizations have in accessing these federal funds. So is there anything you'd like to add to that about those barriers and how reasonable it is to expect that nonprofit organizations can actually participate in this process?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. I will add on what Cristina was saying. The rules are constantly changing, and whenever they kind of select you or pre-select you as a possible recipient of funding, suddenly you have 2 months, when the funds have been out there for 2 years, as just happened to us on FEMA. They just gave us 3 months to put up a complete super challenging proposal that needs, honestly, it needs more time. So in terms of the nonprofit and small organizations, the report has a really, really good recommendations that all of us should see, especially the one of creating a special fund for entities that want to work with recovery and recuperation themes and topics and initiatives. Also, the approach of changing the perspective from individual recovery and recuperation to community, municipality, and collective recuperation, because that's the way that we could see broader possibilities and also solutions on the long run. And I will say that it is necessary to recognize that many organizations, and in the economic context of Puerto Rico right now, we don't have the cash flow to wait for the reimbursement. So the credit option that the report is giving, so all of you should read that part, it's a great option to give us a real opportunity to work and to put our efforts in the recuperation of Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Maria Olga. So now, many in our audience are philanthropy, some from here in Puerto Rico, some who are listening in from the US stateside. So I want to direct a question for them, right, to you, for them. And that question is really, how can philanthropy, right, how can philanthropy support this recovery? What are the things that philanthropy needs to do, and how can we think differently? How can we approach this in the context of Puerto Rico, right? And in the context of everything that you just shared with us. And Deepak, if we can start with you.
So first, I'd like to highlight a key lesson that emanates from the post-disaster academic literature, and that is that funding is what drives reconstruction, and experience shows that more funding is always needed. Now, philanthropy has an important and unique role to play in this reconstruction because they have access to the funds and access to the ears of many key players. And as such, they're in a unique position and need actually to take on a leadership role so that the diverse actors involved in the reconstruction, who are always asking for funds, are actually coordinated. I would say that my second point also emanates from prior literature, and that is that government is but one of the players in post-recovery efforts. New organizations emerge, and some reliable NGOs are often the most efficient and effective respondents in post-disaster contexts. Now, for organizations to emerge and older ones to be able to carry out their job in compressed time and with a degree of effectiveness, they must avoid the incessant chase for money that is a product of short funding cycles and the changing whims of philanthropic partners. In many instances, we have seen this in Puerto Rico. Organizations end up taking on projects that stretch the limits of their capacity and also taking on projects that end up withering away in the vine due to the expiration of funding streams. It's not that organizations cannot learn and take on new roles, but this is a process that should emanate from within. This learning should emanate from within the organizations and not from the indirect pressures of trying to please or respond to the whims of a particular funder. I think that my third point is a bit more sentimental and controversial. I think that we need to ask ourselves, truly ask ourselves, if Puerto Rico is better off today than immediately after the hurricanes. Some days I wake up and think that we're not. And, I think that's on all of us, but especially on the groups and organizations that parachuted into the island right after the disaster, had their photo op, and then left when the going got really tough. We need to really think about how we evaluate what philanthropy and the NGO sector, for that matter, has done in the past 3 years. I also think that foundations that have been committed to Puerto Rico through thick and thin can show other groups a proper way forward. We all need to learn as we move forward, but we must also think about the unintended consequences of our interventions and our omissions. I would just leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Maria Olga, would you like to add to that as well?
Yes, I would say that funders must look a way to fund strategic funding for our organizations, but also meet the day-by-day needs. Because as Deepak was saying many times, we are in a position that we have to decide which way we should go, and we know we have to go in parallel lines, but we need the funding to be in parallel lines to keep the grassroots work and the constant work in the communities, but also to start moving and start holding on the strategic plans that we need to get going.
Gracias, Maria Olga. And Cristina, la última palabra. I think Maria Olga and Deepak said everything that had to be said. I would hone in on the fact that organizations in Puerto Rico are constantly hustling for money. So what's urgent doesn't leave us time to work with what's really important. So when I think about foundations, and we're really grateful for everything that foundations do for Puerto Rico, but I also always have this nagging feeling that it's foundations, the ones that are driving the reconstruction, and not us in Puerto Rico. So I think that the equation has to be reversed, right? We're the ones that know what needs to be done in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of local knowledge, a lot of local expertise. Trust us when we tell you what our priorities are, what we need to do. Funding for operational expenses, it's super required. I mean, we are, I know Maria Olga, I know the work that they do. They're exhausted. They don't have enough resources, like a lot of organizations in Puerto Rico. So we do need funding to strengthen our operational capacity in the group so that we can do more of what needs to be done. I also think that looking at 2-3 year commitments would also be ideal, because it would take the pressure of constantly hustling for money. And we keep on repeating the fact that we're hustling for money, because that's what really needs to be done, right? We have to keep on writing proposals. And, I have proposals that I haven't been able to complete just because of our agenda, it's so urgent. So what do? Do I attend the immediacy of the need of the community, or do I take a break and write a proposal, a long proposal? So I think that there also has to be a different relationship when we work with organizations in Puerto Rico, in recognizing that while it is super urgent that we establish and that we serve as liaisons with other organizations in Puerto Rico, that type of coordination is time consuming, and it also costs, right? So even when we're building bridges, we're working, and that should be compensated. I'm not saying that we don't like to collaborate. I am all up for collaboration. I hope that I'm not being misinterpreted, but that collaboration takes time. So it's, I think that foundations need to see, like Mariolo was saying, they need to see the full picture, that we need operational funding so that we can actually operate. It cannot all be programmatic, right? So I think that equation needs to be also sort of reversed. And again, I can't stress the fact of having 2 to 3 year commitments. I think that is ideal, so that we can do a long-term, not a long-term, because 3 years is not long-term, but a medium-term strategic planning with the funding that we have. That would be my additional comment.
Thank you. So what I heard from the three of you, some things that kind of popped out in that last part to folks in philanthropy who are listening, is starting with that one, listening, right? Listening to the groups here, trusting what they tell you, and then committing to that organization and to the work here as 3 major takeaways. And as part of that listening and trusting and committing is recognizing that those limitations and those, when you make very strict funds, it doesn't really allow the organizations to do the work that they need. So I want to thank the 3 of you for sharing with us, for taking the time to share today on this webinar, for the folks who are listening, for taking the time to listen. Right? That was the first step, listen. Next step, trust what you just heard today. And the third step as we're moving into it is committing here to Puerto Rico and to continue funding here. So thank you all.
Don't go away, we have questions.
Oh, sorry. Big closing.
So, and I'm here to help moderate these questions, but just as a reminder to all the folks that are joining us, leave your questions in the Q&A. And Charlotte, I know you have access, but let me go ahead and start with you with supporting here. So Alida, Puerto Rico needs a core of experts to design a plan to assist and help the municipalities and nonprofits to access the federal recovery money. How the Funders Academy can participate? How can the Funders and Academy participate in this process?
Can
Did
anybody answer that, or?
Yeah.
To that question is that I'm not necessarily sure that it's municipalities and nonprofits that need support in accessing the funding. I think it's actually the central government that needs a better structure on how to disseminate or distribute or make it easy for that funding to be accessed. I cannot learn something that hasn't been designed. So you can design all the frameworks that you want, but again, if the rules of the game keep on changing, there's no amount of technical assistance or capacity building that will support municipalities or nonprofit organizations to access what nobody knows how to access, because it keeps on being changed. So I think that, my response would be that funding needs to be decentralized, right?
Absolutely. I agree with that. And we need to support government to distribute this money.
I would only, if I could just, just one minor point. Karina cited the study that we did that looked at federal funding and actually procurement practices from the federal side regarding recovery dollars. And 90% of federal procurement money was going to US-based firms for work in Puerto Rico. So that is an appalling statistic, right? Now, the key question is, when we ask the federal government, like, what's going on? They say, like, well, Puerto Rican firms don't comply with the procurement rules. Now, why is that? Because of what Cristina mentioned, because it's designed that way. So we need to get the bottom of what are these designs and who these designs help out the most. Now, what is actually very surprising to us is that when we dug deeper after this, we conducted this research, the law states, federal law states that preference shall be given to local firms. Now, the government can, obviate that legal requirement by saying, well, no local firms apply or no local firms qualify. And that's an easy way of circumventing federal law to say, we're just going to give the contracts out to the Beltway bandits that we know, right? And we've seen this all along. We took this issue to Congress. Congressman Nidia Velázquez raised it in one of her committees. And we're committed to actually trying to say, look, if you give local firms and local organizations the opportunity, if you design these rules so that we can actually participate, I'm sure that this recovery will take on a very different tone, and it'll actually lead by us, and it'll actually lead to sustainable results in the long run, which is what actually we want to happen.
Beautiful. So a couple more questions.
Sure.
Did you want to take them or?
Como tú prefieres. ¿Qué prefieres?
I'm just intruding in your session.
No.
Well, I'll hit one and then you can take over. So is there an estimate of how many homes need to be rebuilt and how many need to be repaired? Is there an idea of how much it would cost? Do you guys have, I know from our report, there's over 25,000 with blue roofs still, and there's no recovery money that have gone to actual creation of homes or buildup of homes. Deepak, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, we actually did scour FEMA data from the Individual Assistance Program. And we can only do this because there's a public data set out there that's very messy to work with, but we spend months. This is another lesson for philanthropic engagement. If an organization spends months on research, it's not because it's a whim or it's because a pie in the sky idea. We can actually produce a lot of interesting results to help us in advocacy. So for example, homes with damages in Puerto Rico, based on the individual assistance data, amount to almost 500,000 units. That's about 35% of our housing stock. So 35% of our housing stock had damages. Now the aggregate damage in terms of cost, and FEMA lowballs this estimate because they're not there to dole out money fast, is around $1.6 billion. Average home damage was around $3,800 average, right? So this could be anything from a destroyed home to a window being busted. The average is the sum and the division of all those cases. It's about $3,800. Now, the total homes destroyed in the island, according to FEMA, were about 4,500 homes. This is a lowball estimate.
Yeah.
Yes, as Glenis has mentioned, the government has been very, very slow to react. Now, according to recent data from the R3 program, and this is just basically hot off the presses, they claim that they're currently working on a total of 916 homes that are in progress or are completed. Some of these are under construction, over 400, 100 of them are completed according to their numbers, and I'm not vouching for these. And at least 354 homes are in pre-construction. Whichever way you want to look at these numbers, when 35% of your housing stock has been damaged, these minuscule numbers of reconstruction are a drop in the bucket. 3 years after the storm, and as Glenis mentioned, 25,000 homes, at least that we know of and have been reported by the government, have blue roofs. Imagine how a family that cannot feel safe in their home feels every time there's a weather event, right? So what we're talking about here is a humongous task. The reason we can take the government to task, we do the research, we do the analysis, we take them, we fight them with the same numbers, and we look at the perspective from the communities, and we empower the communities to take on this role also, to actually become effective researchers and advocates of this information.
Awesome. Great. Do you want to take the other one?
Dale, okay. Let's see, I got confused in the process here. Okay, so we have a question from Leticia here, who first gives her thanks to all of you for speaking and encourages you to ask for even longer than the 3-year commitments. These commitments are about creating a justice framework. She asks, I would love to hear how we can help frame this work in light of the work around justice that's happening in the US. How can we begin to shine a light on this disparity as a true issue of justice or lack thereof, especially in this political moment?
I can say something really quick. I love Leticia's comment about the 5 years. I mean, I was pushing it with the 3-year commitment, but of course, I mean, if we could ask for 5-year commitments, that would be ideal with, with benchmarks throughout the process. I think that everything in this conversation is really about equity, right? So there has to be a deeper conversation about all of the inequities that are in existence in Puerto Rico. And I think that that's one of the things that Maria brought us, that it sort of covered, it moved the veil so that people could really see everything that really happens in Puerto Rico when it comes to inequity. But I think that I don't even know how to answer that question other than to say that there has to be a deeper conversation and it has to be addressed at different levels, because even the difference between municipalities, how they're treated versus the central government, there's also inequity there. I mean, I was looking at numbers from the municipality of Coamo in terms of the funding that FEMA was going to give them for some buildings. And the building, they were going to give, for example, $500,000 for the reconstruction of a structure in Coamo, but then the state also requested funding for that, and it was 3 times the amount that they were going to give the municipalities. So there's even disparity in how government is treated in Puerto Rico between the municipal government and the central government. So I think it's an important question. I don't even know how to answer it other than there has to be a deep conversation on how to address it. I don't know if Deepak and Maria Olga, I don't know, Deepak, if you have the response to that, but it's all an issue of equity. So,
I mean, Maria Olga, I want to give you, we've learned over time, in fact, thanks to different grants and different funding streams that we've been working with, what we need for systemic change to happen. And that requires funding, time, and commitment, right? And so yes, longer than 3-year period funding cycles, beautiful. But we also need the flexibility to be able to, in that time frame, to actually learn, adapt, and take on different activities different from what we had originally envisioned. This recovery is probably going to take the better part or even more than 10 years in Puerto Rico. And we're going off just on analyses comparing different disasters in the United States and also in different parts of the world. 10 years is a long time. We're in year 3 and we haven't gotten off the ground. So imagine moving that sort of finish line forward 10 more years. And imagine then, as a funder, having to support and to actually nurture and collaborate with organizations for that amount of time in order to be truly effective and committed to change. I think that that's the only way that we're actually going to be able to identify what's needed, as well as at the same time work towards transformative systems. Systems that are not just there to check a box and say, hey, we built the roof. Hey, we patched the wall. That's important. But what's more important is that those families in those homes feel that this will never happen to them again, because now they have a voice, now they're empowered to move forward, and now their community feels safer. So this is not just also about individual initiatives and helping out X number of homes. It's about transforming an island. And I think that only happens when you're truly committed and you put your money where your mouth is.
María Olga, ¿querías añadir algo ahí?
I totally agree with Cristina and Deepak. I would just add that you will guys see in the report the importance of making a balance in the donations and grants between maybe the repairing the roofs, as Deepak was saying, and the organizational processes that communities and groups needs to have companionship along the years to be empowered and be in position to compete for these funds or be resilient for the next event or be ready to play their citizenship in our society.
Glenys, if I could add, I know I'm not the panelist, but I also, in terms of framing this within the U.S. context right now, I think it is critically important to remember that these inequities, as were brought up at the beginning, did not start with Hurricane Maria here in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has been, and I'll speak as Hispanic Federation, a colony of the United States for many years, and as a result has incredibly inequitable policies directed at that have led to these issues of poverty. Programs that have successfully alleviated poverty in the United States are not accessible here in Puerto Rico. The rules that states have to play during recovery, as Deepak mentioned, are not applied here. We have seen a complete disregard from this administration for Puerto Rico, even talking about can they sell it and just wipe the slate clean. And so I do think, this is just right in line with patterns of what we have seen in the United States historically, but also from this administration, particularly in their disregard for communities of color, particularly Latinos, African Americans, Black and Brown communities. We've seen that disregard for people in COVID, and I think this is a pattern. I don't think this is accidental that Puerto Rico has had this response for the government, and I say that as Hispanic Federation. I'm not speaking for Philanthropy of Puerto Rico or any of the groups here, but I think this is definitely not accidental, the way that this administration has treated Puerto Rico.
Okay, thank you. So with that point in mind, and I know we have a couple of questions that are kind of similar, but I think in a way we're going to touch them in our next session, because we're going to pass on to reflecting with funders, because it's part of the who has been doing the recovery, definitely, and who has showed up to this recovery is Philanthropy, and we'll reflect more on that. But Deepak, Cristina, Maria Olga, Charlotte, thank you so much. This is just, I think, a beginning of a very, very rich conversation that we need to continue to have, and we will. So thank you so much for your time, your comments, and we'll keep talking. So now, thank you. I want to go ahead and let's change a little bit and do more of a dialogue on reflecting from a funder's perspective. So I want to invite Jerry Maldonado, Director of Cities and States for Ford Foundation. Hey, Jerry. And Julie Elrich, Program Advisor and Chief of Staff for the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Thank you so much for being here, both of you.
Of course.
How are you?
Great, thank you.
I mean, we're getting deeper and deeper into this conversation. This last session, I think, was very, very powerful. So I want us to open up and just have a very candid conversation from a funder's perspective. And we have a couple of funders here that they might just join us as we converse.
Yeah. So I think I want to start by thanking Deepak, Maria Olga, and Cristina again for just reminding us, one, of kind of the urgency of now, right? The incredible work that's been done over not just the last 3 years, but the last decade in responding to the multiple crises and like the work that still lies ahead. Yeah. And I think what would be great for us to do in this time is just to have a conversation, right? And we would invite other funders who are on this webinar to join in, to raise your hand when you want to join in the conversation. Because what we really want to reflect on is two things, like why philanthropy needs to continue to commit to the island, and how that work has evolved to date, and how we see it continuing to evolve. And Glenise, I'd love to just start with you, really, to get some on-the-ground reflections, right, about kind of how you've seen philanthropy on the island evolve over the last 3 years in response to some of the big systems challenges, inequalities that folks raised earlier on in the first panel.
Absolutely. I mean, the philanthropic scenario in Puerto Rico has changed over these last 3 years immensely, from a reality that we had. I mean, even us as an organization, that we are a funders collaborative and a philanthropy serving organization. We were called Red de Fundaciones. And these local foundations were really coming together through this organization, through Red de Fundaciones, to make a call out and to philanthropy and do this this shout out that, hey, we're here, there's so much need, there's inequality, we're part of the US, please come and continue support or support in bigger ways. And then we got on the map through Hurricanes Irma and Maria. We were definitely placed on the map, and there was many philanthropic activities and investment that came from stateside, but from big institutions, from the diaspora that got very creative, either in their institutions that they were there, or in corporate giving programs, or even creating funds, or even creating foundations that really came in and supported the island. So currently you have all this diversity of different entities really supporting Puerto Rico, and that was a big burst after Maria, with all the local foundations that we had. And it's been amazing to see just the change from both sides, and how, you know, philanthropy came really to attend a disaster and an activity, and then how they are still committing. We have 22 entities that have committed already to staying long-term in Puerto Rico. And at the same time, the local foundations changed their ways, because there was so many different ways of giving and supporting and supporting the organizations that are still doing the work in many creative ways. So that came within collectives and funds. And so it was a good disruption, I would say, of the philanthropic scenario for everybody involved, not only for philanthropy, mainland philanthropy, local philanthropy, but even to the nonprofits, because as the creativity happened in philanthropy and ways of supporting the creativity in organizations in doing recovery work and stepping up also was amazing.
I mean, that really jives with a lot of what I've seen and felt over the last 3 years. I think it's been interesting to see philanthropy really move from kind of a services and a kind of a charity perspective to a justice perspective. And I think it really is a reflection on the fact that Hurricanes Irma and Maria really shone light on all those structural inequalities that are driven by specific sets of policies and politics, right, that have driven inequality and displacement on the island for decades. So it's not new. And it's interesting for me, you know, I was reflecting on kind of Ford's own kind of experience, my own experience coming in and doing deeper work in Puerto Rico. And I have to say that, you know, my career in philanthropy has kind of been defined by disaster in many ways. I joined Ford in a deep way after Hurricane Katrina, right? And I remember after Hurricane Katrina kind of feeling the pain, the horror, the anger, right? The way all these like racist structural inequalities were laid bare by this natural disaster, by the storm. And I think what we saw in New Orleans was like the perfect collision of like racism, disaster capitalism, and climate change, like all those three storms kind of colliding in one place. And 12 years later, with Irma and Maria, I felt a sick sense of deja vu, just a sick sense of deja vu, right? That we were reliving. And in many ways, there was like a surge of pain and anguish that I know came over many of folks in the diaspora, in philanthropy, Puerto Ricans in philanthropy, and in the broader diaspora. You know, over 3,800 lives lost, billions of dollars of damages, you know, thousands of homes destroyed, and then just government failure, like government failure at all levels, local, island, federal, right? Seeing that perfect confluence. And it was a reminder, right, of why we do, why Ford, why National Philanthropy needs to do this work, right? Because, and I think Leticia raised this question, when we talk about Puerto Rican recovery, it's not just about recovery, it's about injustice, right? And it's about structural inequality, right? And that structural inequality is perpetuated by a series of things. And Marianne raised this early on, right? It's one, perpetuated by kind of the island's colonial and territorial status, right? And that's a structural question, right? That just drives inequality. I think Deepak mentioned it's driven by a dysfunctional and extractive economic system that systematically extracts wealth from the island, right? And then exports our talent, our people, right? Through periods and cycles of displacement. These are real structural challenges, right? That philanthropy grapples with in the US, right? And what we see on the island is that in many ways, the island is kind of on the front line of some of these major challenges that philanthropy kind of engages with in a robust way in the US. But for me, what is both heartening and kind of challenging and discouraging early on, it was heartening, one, to see the way in which kind of the diaspora mobilized, right? The way in which the island, communities across the island mobilized. They didn't wait. There was a real sense of solidarity, creativity, ingenuity that was just powerful on the island. And in the U.S., way in which many of us in philanthropy, Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, mobilized within our own institutions, right? With other allies who mobilized philanthropy like Hispanics and Hispanic Federation, Hispanics in Philanthropy. And that was beautiful. But it was also an organizing kind of effort on behalf of many Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, right? Many Puerto Ricans in philanthropy to kind of make the case, right, for Puerto Rico. Because unfortunately, Karina flagged this, that historically pre-storm, U.S. philanthropy did not pay attention to Puerto Rico, right? It was a pittance, and it was linked to its unique kind of ambiguous status. And I think that's important for philanthropy to really grapple with that, right? Yeah. Because that in and of itself, how we fund, where we fund, who we fund, how we fund, right, is a remnant of structural inequality and racism, right? And we need to grapple with that contradiction within our own sector, right? And so the challenge here, when we talk about decolonization, it's not just about a status, it's also about how we decolonize philanthropy. Yes. To make sure that resources are driven to the places where it needs to go. And I know, Julie, I mean, this is really interesting to hear your reflections about how Mellon got engaged in this space.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jerry. And thanks, Glenise, also for including us in this conversation. I think we come to this work asking a lot of the same questions that you flagged, which are, what are the historical injustices that have led to a circumstance in which philanthropy has vastly underfunded in Puerto Rico, as in other parts of the in the mainland U.S. Often, I think the underfunding are a result of similar patterns, not of colonialism in the same way, but in different ways, and patterns of racism. And so, for example, like the South, I mean, you mentioned Katrina, New Orleans, like the American South is also hugely underfunded within philanthropy. And so, so I think when Mellon started to focus more resources on grant making in Puerto Rico, which happened, I would say, both in response to the hurricanes and with the change in leadership that brought our current president, Elizabeth Alexander, who came with real commitment and awareness of the injustices in the funding structures and a desire to redress them, both in terms of increased focus on Puerto Rico and in terms of increased focus in certain areas in the mainland US that have been underfunded. So those two things kind of happened at the same time and really amped up the focus of the Mellon Foundation on focusing more resources on Puerto Rico. And we've done so and tried to do so in a way that is evidencing a multi-year, many years commitment. But because Mellon, like many other philanthropies, had so vastly underfunded in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis other places, we were quick to triple what we had given in grants in the last 18 years, we gave in the last 2 years. I'm sorry, we doubled in the last 2 years. So, I think we feel like the work that we are doing now is vastly improved in terms of the amount from the work we had been doing before. But the starting point, as it is for much of philanthropy, was pretty low, right? And so these are important first steps in addressing the impacts of these historical injustices, but they're really only first steps. And so and we see it as part of a broader conversation about racial justice, around economic justice. So we really do, at least from the Mellon perspective, think about the need for philanthropy to commit to Puerto Rico as being part of those conversations. One thing I've been hearing in the conversations today and thinking and talking with you both, Glenise and Jerry, is about the question of how different sectors can be part of recovery. So, there's been some focus today and on certain sectors, but one thing we think about a lot at Mellon both in Puerto Rico in response to natural disasters in other places, and certainly in response to the pandemic and the effects it's had in Puerto Rico and beyond, is the importance of the arts in recovery, and how the arts are really, really integral to recovery for many, many communities. And that's sort of bringing our Mellon focus and perspective, but curious how you two think about that in your work, the role of the sectors you fund, or Glenys, the foundations, the funders with whom you work, and thinking about how various sectors can play their role to really help amplify the recovery.
Yes, I'll let you answer, Jerry, but I do want to address this question with a little side note, because we had a question. Somebody asked about these guides that we are talking about today. This one is very recovery focused, but we are going to have guides that are from education, environment, and arts and culture. So we'll probably have this conversation with a very much focus of arts and culture, because local funders and funders for stateside definitely are heavy on the arts. It's something that's well known, that it's good for health, for mental health, for expression, for us as Puerto Ricans, and having this interesting relationship that we have with the US. It's just another form of expression of who we are and how we understand each other from the different perspectives that we have. So arts is something that is always part of recovery, and from philanthropy's perspective, it's always definitely supported.
I'll add that culture is a source of power, right? And it would be kind of foolish of us, right, not to think about how we invest in kind of that sector as part of a broader movement for advancing kind of a just and equitable recovery, right? And I think what we've seen are really amazing examples. Movements are driven by storytelling, by music, right? By cultural expressions, right? Look at all the great movements on the island, right?
Oh,
and at its center, right, are questions of...
When we overthrew the governor, how creative was that?
Right. No, it was driven by like music and street theater, and right? It's all part of that, right? And so if what we're saying is that we want to invest in a strategy that really, I think as the previous panelist said, builds from the ground up, builds and invests in local people, local organizations and capacity, right? That we need to think about that sector in a much more kind of integrated way, right? And I feel like, from our perspective, we've both been kind of trying to invest in some anchor organizations, trying to expand our work in this space, but also, the piece around storytelling and narrative is really, really important, right? If you think about, I think, and Glenys, reflecting on important anchor organizations like the Center for Investigative Journalism, right? Critical role, right? And so, or other kind of anchor organizations and networks, and at OSF, other folks have invested in kind of networks of organizations. I think that's super important. And Julie, I'm curious, question for you and for Glenys.
I was going to ask a question as well.
Oh, please, jump in.
I was like, I want to know what you both have learned by your work in Puerto Rico. And how is that maybe changing, or how are you looking? How are you adjusting, if in any way?
Jerry, you want to take it first?
No, please.
Well, I think we've learned a lot. We, as funders based in New York, in the mainland, without offices in other places, we are aware of the limits of our perspective and the limits of our knowledge. And so I would say we've learned a lot we learned a lot about the substantive areas we fund. So we've spent a lot of time over the last 2 years traveling to the island, meeting with folks on the ground, figuring out how to do that, exactly what you're saying, Jerry, how to bring our resources to bear to support what is growing up naturally and productively and organically and energetically and beautifully in communities in Puerto Rico. And so, we've learned a lot about great work being done on the ground, particularly in arts and culture, but not only in arts and culture. We have learned, I think, quite a bit about how to understand, and again, from our perspective as funders based in New York, how to think about diaspora and how work to support folks in diaspora can relate to work to support folks on the island, but in that conversation also how important it is to really center resources and power with people who are on the island, who are staying on the island, and how to help, and again, this is particularly in the arts and culture sector, how to think about allowing our resources to help people stay where they want to be, and to create community and to create art and to have stability and to have the resources to do what they want to be doing for themselves in their artistic practice, for their communities, and to feel like that can be a sustainable thing for them to be where they want to be doing the work that they want to be doing. You know, we've learned a lot about how to bring some of what I would consider to be Mellon's more traditional grant making in areas like conservation of art objects and of archives to bear to help in recovery from the hurricanes. So, you know, thinking about archival documents being destroyed that are vital to the history of Puerto Rico, recently supporting work to help digitize documents relating to records of enslaved people in Puerto Rico. And so like, how can we bring what can feel, I think, a little bit out of, like, not necessarily aligned with today's urgent social justice issues, but bring it to bear to support the work that needs to be done to make sure that Puerto Ricans, that, you know, the island can tell its full history and allow that work to happen. So I would say we learned a lot about the substance, but also a lot about how to bridge the mainland island divide and try to bring our resources to bear in a way that puts our grantees on the island in the driver's seat and allows our resources to allow their work to flourish. Jerry, curious for what you think based with your larger perspective, because we've been focused on Mellon's specific areas from our perspective. So curious what you're learning.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been amazing to be engaged so deeply over the last few years. And the first thing that we've learned is that, you know, or reaffirmed the incredible amount of innovative organizing, leadership, kind of initiatives that are on the island now, right? There is an incredible amount of innovation that's driving real change in ways that I think are real kind of national models, right? When you look at kind of work like the G8 and kind of the land trust effort, or kind of the work that's happening with the mutual aid associations, or the incredible work that's happening around cultural organizing on the island, right? The incredible work that's evolving work happening within kind of the feminist collectives that are working on the intersection of kind of gender, reproductive rights, and race. There is this richness of work, right? And work that is having real impact actually kind of on the ground, but that, you know, unfortunately, historically has just been under-resourced, right? By philanthropy. And so that requires, though, a certain kind of caring, right? To be able to kind of invest in these organizations and individuals, organizations, and networks in a way that really helps build an ecosystem of organizations on the island. And so I'd say that in addition to kind of reaffirming what we've heard from many of our partners, right? The fact that we need to move away from project-specific support to general operating, to have a multi-year, 3 to 5 years, right? In ways that really build indigenous leadership. I think we've also learned that it's really important to have the right kind of philanthropic infrastructure on the island, right? And because as a national funder, different national donors have different entry points or not into place. And for us, what's facilitated our deeper engagement is working in partnership with a number of allies. So I think about, for example, the Adelante Fund at Philanthropia as kind of an initial entry point for us. I think about the Amplify Fund at NFG, right? That actually created a really innovative resident local advisory driven strategy process, right? Where the grantees shape strategy and are deciders. I think about the Maria Fund, right? That is really deeply thinking about how we build real civic engagement, organizing, advocacy capacity, right? And building it in a way that's networked. For me, that's kind of the front line, right? Work that will pay huge dividends kind of moving forward.
Great.
I do want to just say, Jerry, to your point about thinking about infrastructure. So how, like the thinking about the nonprofit infrastructure on the island, that's been a big place of learning for us. And I think one that's important that we've heard from folks on this webinar, but also just learning about some of the challenges that have led organizations and small and large in Puerto Rico to not have access to the same funds, even when the funds are available. What limited funds have been made available from philanthropy and also from government sources to small nonprofit groups in Puerto Rico, that there are there's so little infrastructure to help groups get their C3 status to help make it possible. So one thing I know that we've learned a lot about and thought with you and others is about how to help, how there might be ways to bridge that gap so that what funding does exist and is directed at the island can be made more widely and easily available with fewer hurdles, and making it easier to get access to those funds.
Yeah. I think that's critical, and a lesson learned post-Katrina, right? That we need to create infrastructure to support community and movement-based organizations so that they can continue to do their work and grow without creating kind of unnecessary obstacles for them, right?
Absolutely. I'm kind of checking questions because I think there might be a couple of other funders that might want to chime into the conversation in these last couple of minutes that we have. Actually, Karina, I think if you want to join us, you have a couple of comments here that if you want to bring them over. Yes.
No, I was just reflecting on the conversation, and thank you all. This has been a really rich conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Just reflecting that around Leticia's comment of, how does this relate to what's happening in the United States, the different social justice movements, racial justice movements, and I think that it's also important for Puerto Rico to look at Latin America, to look at the Caribbean, because our identities are so entangled also in Latin America and the Caribbean, and there are so many examples that we can look for there. And to also, I know that this conversation has very much been focused on U.S. funders, but to really, I think we need to expand our organizing capacity to start bringing in other international funders, Latin America funders that are looking to expand the work in the Caribbean, because Puerto Rico can fall into both, into those foundations that are looking to invest, for example, in the South. Well, can you look at Puerto Rico as part of your Southern investments, and then international organizations looking at issues of decolonization or other issues of injustice, to look at the island. So, I agree that colonization is part of the main issue that really drives a lot of these inequities, but on the other side, we're uniquely positioned to receive money from foundations on the international and on the national level.
Beautiful. Thank you. So we have a couple more minutes left, but I go ahead. You can stay, Karina. I want to go ahead and ask, why did you sign the pledge? And what are you hoping with by signing the pledge? What are you hoping that happens?
I can speak for sorry, I was waiting for a siren to stop in the background. I'm happy to speak from the Mellon perspective to that. I think, as I mentioned before, there has been a commitment on our part, as a quiet commitment on our part as a foundation, to direct grant dollars to Puerto Rico for over a period of time. So, we have, starting at the end of 2018, sort of quietly internally made a commitment to do so for at least 5 and likely 10 years. And we started to engage in that grant making, as I mentioned before. But we realized that we hadn't sort of said that publicly and used whatever voice Mellon has to plant a flag for other people in our fields, other organizations in our fields, for other funders, to say that we are committed to this, that it matters, and that it matters to say ahead of time, we are making a commitment, we are planting a flag that this is a priority, and we want to help bring attention to the relative dearth of philanthropic resources directed in Puerto Rico, not only through our words, but through our deeds. And both through our grant making and through us being part of waving this important flag that needs to be waved. So we signed the pledge, one, because we are committed and wanted to make that commitment plain, and two, to try to help in whatever way we can draw attention to the work that the group that you, Glenice, are doing, and that Karina, you and OSF, that groups that have been trying to bring attention to this important issue and to the inequities are doing. So we want to be part of the effort to raise those voices, raise your voices, raise our voice, and help say to other funders in the US that this is something people need to be thinking about and acting on.
Awesome. Karina, you want to share why you signed?
Yeah, I've spoken a lot, so I'll leave my turn to somebody else.
And I know there's a couple of funders here with us that have signed the pledge. So if you want to kind of join in, we can grab you and give a shout out to you. Just go ahead and raise your hand. Jerry is having some slight difficulties, but he'll be back with us in a minute. But just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll grab you and ask you why you've signed the pledge. Let me see. I don't see any raised hands. So if at the bottom of your chat, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Glenice? Yes, thank you, Oxfam. We know you signed and we're lucky to have you. Do anybody else? And Jerry, just let us know when you're back. This is what happens in this new reality. Okay, so nobody else would like to join us for the moment.
Well, I will take the mic then, and I'll just say that.
Oh, we do have one, but go ahead.
For Open Society, I think it's really important to continue to publicly voice our support for the island. I think you asked the question about how we have shifted. Well, we have now established, presence on the island. I'm based here in San Juan. We have another staff member that's based here. We're closer to the ground, to the local philanthropy, to the groups. We're responding more quickly to the needs on the ground. So I think it's important to continue to reaffirm that commitment and to continue to shift and organize other funders so that they can come to the island and support our philanthropic efforts here.
Great. Thank you, Karina. And I did see a raised hand. So Anja, if you could just give us that raised hand and pass them over. And Jerry, let us know if you are around. I do know you signed the pledge and you definitely committed. So I don't want to burst the bubble on the announcement either. So when you're ready, you can join us. Let's see.
I just want to add one thing, Glenice, while we're waiting for for whoever raised their hand and for Jerry to come back if he can, to say, I think not only in signing the pledge is not only important for Mellon to say, we are voicing support, but also in the substance of the pledge to say that the support, to urge people to urge people and institutions to consider longer term support, to consider flexible support, to consider support that is driven by what folks say they need to do the work they need to do for their communities. And so it's not just the importance of the dollars, but also of how you and everyone signing the pledge is calling on funders to make decisions about what to fund and how to fund.
And how they're committing to Puerto Rico as well. Absolutely. Totally agree. And that is the pledge. If you have not seen the pledge, we will put you the link for you to sign the pledge. Okay, I think Jerry's back. I was just mentioning that, yay, we have you in our final moments. We couldn't leave without you, Jerry. And I'll let you to answer that, but we are putting the link, and you left again. We are putting the link of the pledge, which really it says it's a commitment to maintain, strengthen, and expand your commitment, your philanthropic commitment to Puerto Rico, and really invest in local communities and invest in local leaders, invest in local organizations that are committed to a just, equitable, and inclusive recovery efforts, and continue to support them long-term in a very flexible manner. That is what they are what really serves their mission. So thank you for all the comments that I see here. And Jerry, you kind of came and left. I don't want to leave and say goodbye without having you join us for last one conversation. So thank you, Amplify, yes for signing. Jerry says sound went down, but Ford is committed to this pledge and addressing structure inequality and onward. Okay, Serna and Andrew Family Foundation are also excited to sign the pledge. Yes, we saw them. We have 22 signatures till the moment. And I was expecting Jerry to join us for these final comments, but it seems he might not join us. But I know Ford has a very big commitment to of $10 million for Puerto Rico in the coming years. And I wanted him to make that, but I thank him. And I thank you, Julie, for being part of this. I thank all of you, our panelists and organizations that are doing all the deep work in a consistent manner, right? Because this really takes energy to keep going. So we honor and value all the organizations that are participating in all these recovery efforts. Hey, Kelly, you wanted to join us and tell us why you signed?
Yes, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to weigh in and join our colleagues in following the front lines, those who have been struggling to build power in communities and to continue to shift power, right? Both within the philanthropic sector, but also with those who are continuing to fight for justice and racial justice in particular. So CERDNA and AFF, we're proud to stand with you all in solidarity. Valente.
Thank you. Gracias, Kelly. Thank you. And thank you all. Jerry, I'm kind of stalling here just to see if you can join us for one last call out to say goodbye, but it seems you might not join us. Again, just saying I want to thank everybody, all the participants today to make this webinar possible, for everybody that jumped in and talked about solidarity, all the great questions that you made. That this is just a beginning of a conversation that we definitely need to continue, but continue mostly with our actions, and our actions not only of investments, but also of how we do those investments. So we are here. Thank you so much. We'll be sharing the recording of this conversation and all the reports and information that that we've been talking about. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and have a great Friday and good evening. Hey, Karina and Jerry, if you're there, we missed you on the goodbye. Oh, there we are. Okay, bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody that attended. This is great.